Her fingers let go, and in that instant, the boy vanished into the icy abyss. But before the water closed over him, his last word, filled with pain and forgiveness, forever imprisoned her in the depths of her own horror. But before he drowned, he managed to say one word that made her shudder in terror, one word that swallowed her soul into eternal darkness. The icy wind cut against Alice Holloway's face as she walked along the snowy path, holding 8-year-old Jacob's hand. He obediently followed her, stumbling now and then over the uneven crust of snow. The evening was growing darker, and the white hills, covered in snow, looked even colder under the moonlight. Jacob was bundled up in a warm coat, a fur-lined hat, and mittens that dangled loosely from his thin wrists. He blinked his long, light eyelashes, glancing around, not understanding why his stepmother remained silent. "Do we really have to go this far?" he finally asked, trying to read her expression. Alice slowed her steps for a brief moment. "Yes, Jacob. It's a surprise." Her voice was even, almost gentle. The boy smiled. "What kind of surprise?" She didn't answer. Ahead of them stretched a frozen lake, its surface smooth and shiny like glass. The ice was thin, gleaming under the dim light. Alice stopped, staring into the dark water beneath the ice. Just one step, she thought, tightening her grip on his small hand. Jacob looked up at her with slight concern. "What if the ice cracks?" Alice knelt down, gazing directly into his blue eyes. "Do you trust me?" "Yes." The boy hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She smiled, but it was an empty smile. "Then go ahead." Jacob stepped onto the ice obediently. He was scared, but he didn't want to disappoint her. And then, the ice beneath him cracked. Everything happened too fast. The boy screamed as the surface splintered, and the freezing water swallowed him whole. Alice watched as he sank. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears, slow and steady, like the ticking of a clock. Tick. So simple. Tick. Just turn around and walk away. Tick. But then she heard his voice, soft, trembling, yet filled with something she couldn't understand. "I forgive you." Alice froze. Her fingers clenched into fists. Something hot ignited inside her. She turned. The ice cracked again. His small hand disappeared beneath the surface. In the next instant, she was crawling onto the ice, breaking it with her hands, her blood dripping into the freezing water. But she didn't care. She grabbed him, pulled him onto the shore, and clutched him tightly in her arms. "Jacob." His lips were blue. He was shaking in her embrace. Alice looked at him, feeling something inside her chest shatter. Fear, remorse. She had saved him. But could she now save herself? The snow beneath her knees was as hard as stone, but Alice didn't feel the pain. All her attention was fixed on the boy in her arms. He wasn't moving. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyelashes were dusted with frost. His lips had turned blue. "Jacob," she rasped, hoping he would answer. No response. A slow, all-consuming wave of terror rose inside her. This couldn't be happening. His chest rose, just barely, breathing, weak, but it was there. Alice let out a choked sob, her hands trembling as she shook him gently, trying to wake him. "Jacob, open your eyes, please." No reaction. Her entire body was shaking from the cold, but the fear was stronger. Her ears were ringing, a deep, rhythmic pounding. She forced herself to her feet, swaying, clutching him tighter. His head lolled limply onto her shoulder. Her heart nearly stopped. "You can't." "Not now." Her voice was shaking, raw. She took a step, then another. The snow crunched beneath her boots. The cold bit into her skin. But she kept moving. She had to. If she stopped, he might not survive. If she stopped, it would all be over. Time lost meaning. Alice had no idea how long she trudged through the snowdrifts, how her legs had gone numb, how her fingers felt as frozen as the dead. Only the sound of her own breath and the faint rhythm of his heart kept her going. Jacob couldn't die. But what if he woke up and looked at her the same way he had before he fell through the ice? "I forgive you." Those words wouldn't leave her mind. Forgiveness, pain, guilt. She saw the road. Tears filled her eyes, but they froze before they could fall down her cheeks. Salvation. But did she deserve it? Headlights illuminated her face. She raised a hand, but the world spun around her. The sharp screech of brakes. "Oh my God!" A voice. Someone's voice. Alice felt hands grabbing her, but she only clung to Jacob even tighter. "Is he alive?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Someone checked his breathing. "He's very weak. We need to get him to a hospital. Now." As the ambulance doors slammed shut, Alice closed her eyes. She had saved him. But from what? From herself? Inside the ambulance, the air smelled of medicine, plastic, and cold, but Alice couldn't smell anything. All she could hear were the muffled voices of the paramedics and the faint, barely perceptible breathing of Jacob. His small body was wrapped in a warm blanket, but he didn't wake up. He was too quiet, too still. "No, no, no, not this. Will he wake up?" Alice didn't recognize her own voice. The paramedic sitting next to her glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to the monitors. "He has severe hypothermia, but there's a chance. A chance. A chance." She clenched her frozen fingers, but she couldn't even feel them. If she hadn't turned back, if she had walked away, if he hadn't said that one word, "I forgive you," nausea rose in her throat. She didn't deserve his forgiveness. She didn't deserve a chance. But he was still breathing, and now she had to do everything to make sure he lived. The hospital corridor was long, endlessly white. Alice sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands clenched into fists, while the doctors worked behind the closed door. Her head was spinning. Chaos. Voices from the past and present blurred together into an indistinguishable hum. "He's going to be okay." The doctor's voice pulled her out of her daze. She snapped her head up. "Are you sure?" The doctor nodded. "He needs time. He was in the water for too long, but he's a strong boy. You saved him just in time. Just in time. As if she were a hero. As if she wasn't the one who had almost killed him." Alice felt her chest tighten, as if an icy hand had wrapped around her heart, but then she heard the rustling of a blanket. She froze, turned, and saw Jacob. He was pale with dark circles under his eyes, but he had opened them, and he was looking at her. Something inside her flipped upside down. Jacob was alive, but did he know the truth? Did he remember what had happened? And if he did, would he forgive her again? Alice couldn't breathe. She stared into Jacob's eyes but couldn't force herself to say anything. He was alive. His lips were dry, his face still too pale. But he was looking at her. Her heart pounded wildly. What did he remember? Did he remember her hands pushing him into the water? Did he remember the icy abyss closing around him? Did he remember trying to breathe when the air turned into frozen needles? She couldn't bear it, but he said nothing. He only looked at her, and that gaze was tearing her apart from the inside. Doctor." His voice was weak, barely a whisper. Alice felt her heart plummet into the abyss. He didn't say her name. He didn't call for her. He didn't recognize her, or he didn't want to. "It's okay, Jacob. You're in the hospital," the doctor said, stepping closer to check his pulse. The boy shifted his gaze to him, blinking slowly. "Did I drown?" Alice tensed. The doctor nodded. "You were in the freezing water for almost 3 minutes, but someone saved you." Someone. Not her. The doctor didn't say who. Jacob frowned slightly, thinking. He was remembering. Alice clenched her hands on her lap. If he remembered. There was darkness, his voice was barely audible, and cold. He blinked. And, Mom, Alice froze. You saw your mother? The doctor asked, intrigued, jotting something down on his tablet. Jacob nodded slowly. She was calling me, but I told her I had to come back. Alice clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. She couldn't breathe. He was supposed to die, but he came back. Later, after the doctor left, leaving them alone, Alice couldn't bring herself to move. Jacob lay there, staring at the ceiling. She had to say something. But how? How do you say, I'm sorry, when you don't deserve forgiveness? How do you say, I'm glad you're alive, when you were the one who tried to take that life away? In the end, she just stayed seated, and he said nothing to her. Just lay there, just stayed silent. But that silence spoke louder than any words. He remembered. He knew. And now it was up to him to decide whether he would forgive her again. Alice had never been afraid of silence, but this silence was different. She was drowning in it. Jacob didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't ask what had happened. He just watched her, and that gaze burned worse than the freezing water. She couldn't bear it. How do you feel? She finally asked. The boy blinked. Cold. His voice was quiet, like shattered glass. Alice nodded. The doctor said you're going to be okay. He said nothing again. She couldn't take it. Time lost all meaning. She sat by his bed, listening to the monotonous beeping of the machines. The doctor said he was fine, that he was physically healthy. But what about his soul? What was he feeling? Alice didn't know, and it was killing her, slowly, painfully. Later, when the room was dark, Jacob finally spoke. I remember. Alice froze. Her heart stopped. What do you remember? Her voice almost broke. Jacob turned to her, and then she saw his eyes, not angry, not filled with hatred, but not filled with trust either. Everything. One word, like a sentence. Alice felt her heart tighten. I remember. Those two words cut her to pieces. She sat in the cold hospital room, facing the child she had tried to kill. He remembered everything. But why wasn't he screaming? Why wasn't he saying he hated her? Why was his voice so calm? Jacob. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry. The boy watched her. Calmly. Too calmly. As if he was waiting. Her voice trembled. What could she say? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. But she had meant to. She had been ready to leave him there. She had been ready to forget him like something worthless. But he hadn't let her. He had forgiven her even before she saved him. Why? Aren't you afraid of me? She asked, her own voice sounding foreign. Jacob was silent for a long time. Then he said something she never expected. It was scarier down there, under the water. Alice clenched her teeth. Do you hate me? The boy stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. No. Alice couldn't bear it. She shot to her feet, fists clenched. Why? Why wasn't he screaming? Why wasn't he calling her a monster? Why didn't he want her dead? But Jacob only shrugged. You saved me. Alice closed her eyes. She hadn't saved him. She had been killing him. And now he had turned her salvation into her punishment. She wanted to hear curses. She wanted to hear hatred. But instead, she got the one thing she feared most: forgiveness. Alice didn't know how long the silence had lasted. She sat beside the hospital bed, feeling something heavy pressing against her chest. Jacob was silent again. After his last words, You saved me. She couldn't even look him in the eyes. She hadn't saved him. She had tried to kill him. And if he hadn't said those words before sinking beneath the water, she wouldn't have stopped. That thought burned inside her, corroding her soul. His forgiving gaze tormented her more than if he had screamed at her, begged for help, or hated her. But he didn't, and that was what was killing her. The night passed in a haze. Alice didn't sleep. She listened to the soft rhythm of Jacob's breathing, listened to the slow drip of the IV, but the worst part was inside her. She had thought it would all end now, that he would wake up and forget. But he remembered, and he said he didn't hate her. Why? How could someone not hate a murderer? Alice couldn't bear it. In the morning, the doctor entered the room. "Jacob, how are you feeling?" The boy turned to him. "Fine." Alice tensed. He was lying. She knew it. "Did you sleep well?" Jacob nodded slowly. "Yes." Another lie. She knew he hadn't slept, just like she hadn't. "Good. We'll keep you here for a couple more days, and then you'll be discharged." Alice felt something inside her break. What would happen then? What would she tell his father? How could she look him in the eyes? His wife had left his son to die, and he had no idea. But when he found out... The doctor left, leaving them alone. Jacob was silent again. But this time Alice couldn't stay silent. "Jacob." He looked at her. "What?" She didn't know what to say. You really don't." Her voice wavered. Jacob tilted his head. "Don't what?" Alice shut her eyes. "Aren't angry." She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want him to lie again. But he didn't. "No." Alice couldn't take it. She jumped up, covering her face with her hands. "Why?" She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. Jacob looked at her, and then he asked the one thing she feared most. "Would you rather I was?" She heard his question, but she couldn't believe he had asked it. "Would you rather I was angry?" How could he look at her so calmly and ask that? Her hands trembled. Her lips were dry. She couldn't answer. The words got stuck in her throat. Jacob waited, calmly, patiently. He was waiting for her answer, but what could she say? Yes, be angry, hate me, despise me because I deserve it. Or, no, please don't look at me like that. Don't make this worse. She didn't know. She just didn't know. "If you want, I can be angry," he said at last. His voice was so quiet, yet it sounded louder than a scream. Alice let out a shaky breath. "Jacob." She barely recognized her own voice. He tilted his head. "Do you really want that?" Alice shut her eyes. Yes. Yes, let him hate her. Let him scream. Let him call the doctors. Let him tell them the whole truth. Let his father find out what kind of monster he had let into their lives. Let it all end. But he didn't do any of that. He was just waiting for her answer, her hands clenched into fists. "I don't know," she whispered. An eternity passed before he spoke again. "When I was in the water, I was really scared." Alice flinched. Every word cut into her like a blade. "I felt myself being pulled down." His eyes were clear, too clear for a child. "I knew I didn't have the strength to get out." Alice gritted her teeth. "But I wasn't upset." She snapped her gaze to him. He didn't blink. "I just realized I had nowhere to go back to." Alice stopped breathing. "Nobody loves me," he said evenly. "Not you, not Dad, no one." Something inside her shattered. "That's not true." Her voice was hoarse. Jacob shrugged. "Then why did you push me?" Alice couldn't answer. She wanted to die right there, in that room. She didn't know what words could ever fix this, because they didn't exist. But Jacob already knew the answer. Alice felt her heart plummet into an abyss. "Then why did you push me?" That question shattered her into 1,000 pieces. She couldn't answer. She just couldn't. Her chest tightened as if someone had clamped her ribs in a vice. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She had no right to cry. She had tried to kill him. This child, this little person who had trusted her, whom she had betrayed. And now he was simply waiting for her answer. But how could she explain something like this? How could she explain that in that moment she believed it was the right thing to do? How could she justify being ready to leave him to die? Jacob didn't look away. That gaze pierced straight through her. There was no hatred in it, no fear, only disappointment. And that was the worst part. If he had screamed, if he had hit her, if he had called for the doctors, told them everything, it would have been easier. But he didn't. He just waited. Her voice trembled. The words stuck in her throat like shards of glass. I don't know. Jacob nodded slowly. I know. Alice froze. He knew. He knew everything. And that could only mean one thing. He understood her better than she understood herself. She couldn't bear it. She suddenly stood, pressing her hands to her temples. I can't. Jacob didn't say a word. He just watched her. That gaze was killing her. I'll be back, she murmured, turning toward the door. The handle was cold. She was about to leave when she heard his voice, software barely audible, but it struck louder than a thunderclap. Do you not want to see me? Alice stopped. She couldn't believe he had asked that. She couldn't believe that this child, the one she had nearly killed, was now afraid she would abandon him. No, her voice broke. She turned back to him. No, Jacob. She couldn't finish the sentence, but he understood, and his eyes softened. Alice collapsed to her knees beside his bed. She couldn't hold it in anymore. She was shattering, falling apart. But Jacob just looked at her, silently, accepting her brokenness. Alice was trembling. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't see those eyes, not filled with confusion, but with something far worse. Acceptance. He had accepted her betrayal, accepted her as the person who had tried to kill him, and it was tearing her apart. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve for him to look at her as if she were still human. But he did. Are you crying? Jacob asked softly. Alice let out a choked sob. She hadn't even realized her body was shaking with uncontrollable tears. She couldn't remember the last time she had cried. But now her tears were hot, burning like molten metal. She was a monster. But he was forgiving her. How could he? How could he be so strong when she was so weak? You won't do it again, will you? His voice shattered her into 1,000 pieces. He asked it so simply, as if it were just an ordinary question. But he knew the truth. He knew she could have walked away, that she could have never looked back. And yet, he still asked. She sobbed, shaking her head. No, no, Jacob, never. Her voice was raw, like a drowning person gasping for air. But he still didn't know the worst part. Alice looked at him and realized she still hadn't told him the truth. Why? That question made her breath catch in her throat. Why? Why had she done it? Why had she pushed him into the water? Why had it felt right in that moment? How could she explain something that couldn't be explained? She covered her mouth with her hand, feeling herself breaking, collapsing, screaming inside. She couldn't breathe. Jacob didn't look away. Did I annoy you? His voice was calm, too mature for an 8-year-old. Alice wanted to disappear. No, she cried out, her voice almost cracking. Was I a burden? Jacob, no, she sobbed. Then... He paused before whispering the worst question of all. Did you hate me? Alice let out a sob so raw it shook her entire body. She couldn't lie anymore. She couldn't hide anymore. She was a monster. No, she finally said. I hated myself. Jacob blinked. His lips trembled. What? I didn't hate you, Jacob. Her voice broke, but she kept speaking. I hated who I had become. I hated my life. I hated myself. He didn't know what to say, but now he understood. He understood that she hadn't wanted to kill him because of him. She had wanted to kill the part of herself that couldn't accept that she had lost. She had lost to his mother. She had lost to his father. She had lost to herself. and in that moment when the ice cracked beneath him, she had decided she could erase that part of her life. But now he was looking at her differently. Now he knew. "I still don't want to be angry at you," Jacob said quietly. Alice closed her eyes. How could she explain to him that hatred would be easier than forgiveness? How could she explain that if he forgave her, it meant he would forgive others, even when he shouldn't? How could she explain that some things didn't deserve forgiveness? But he had already made his choice, and his words made her collapse to her knees and cry harder than she ever had before. Alice sobbed like a child. Her shoulders trembled. Her chest rose and fell in ragged gasps. But Jacob just watched her. He didn't say a word. He didn't pull away. He didn't turn his back on her. He saw her for who she really was, weak, broken, terrified. And that was the scariest part. She didn't know how long she cried. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when she finally managed to breathe, her voice was hoarse and broken. You know I'm still a monster, right?" Jacob tilted his head, studying her. His blue eyes were clear, piercing straight into her soul. "No," he finally said. Alice's breath caught. But if you were a monster," he interrupted, "you wouldn't have saved me." Alice froze. Those words hit harder than if he had screamed at her. She couldn't accept them. "I saved you because you said—" She couldn't finish. Jacob nodded slowly. "Because I said I forgive you." Alice clenched her fists. "That doesn't mean I deserve that forgiveness." The boy simply shrugged. "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve, Alice." She flinched. "It's something you give." She closed her eyes. God, how could he be so wise? How could the child she had betrayed say something like that? How could he be stronger than her? "But that doesn't make what I did right." Jacob pressed his lips together as if thinking, and then he said the words that turned her soul inside out. "No, but it gives you a chance to be better." Alice couldn't take it. She turned away, gripping her hair with shaking fingers. "Jacob, you don't understand. I don't deserve this. You shouldn't give me a chance." She was almost yelling now. "You should hate me. You should tell your father the truth. You should—" "I should only do what I want to do." She stopped. Jacob looked at her firmly, with certainty. "And I want you to stay." Alice was speechless. He wanted her to stay? After everything? After what she had done? Her lips trembled. "I don't deserve that." Jacob sighed. "I know." Alice let out a shaky breath. But you can try." She didn't know how to accept that. She didn't know if she could. But one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't leave. Not now. Not after this conversation. Alice couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. Her fingers trembled. Her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. She didn't know how to handle this. How do you keep living, knowing that the one you betrayed not only survived, but doesn't hate you? How do you accept forgiveness when you don't deserve it? "You'll stay, won't you?" Jacob's voice sent a shiver through her. His words struck at the very core of her pain. She couldn't answer right away. She didn't know if she could. "Why do you want that?" Her voice was raw, hoarse. Jacob looked at her strangely, as if she had asked a foolish question. "Because I need you." Alice closed her eyes, feeling something inside her tighten into a painful knot. How could he say that? After everything. After the betrayal. After the frozen lake. But I did something terrible," she whispered. Jacob nodded slowly. "Yes." Alice felt something inside her crack. She wanted him to lie, to say, "No, it's okay." But he didn't. He told the truth, and that was worse than if he had hated her. The room fell unbearably silent. The silence pressed down on her. The silence screamed louder than any words. "You won't do it again, right?" His voice was soft but steady. Alice met his gaze. Those blue eyes looked straight into her soul. She felt fear, because now he believed in her. He was giving her a second chance. And if she lost it, she would never be able to go back. "No, Jacob," her voice was firm as steel. "Never." He smiled, a small, weak smile, but it broke her more than all the tears, because now he trusted her, and Alice knew. She would never betray that trust again. She couldn't. Alice hadn't slept all night. She sat in the same position, leaning over Jacob's bed, never taking her eyes off him. He had forgiven her. He trusted her. But did she deserve it? She was afraid of the answer. But now a different kind of fear was growing inside her with every passing hour. How would she explain everything to his father? She couldn't avoid it. Brandon Holloway had to know, and once he did, Alice would no longer be his wife. Early in the morning, the door to the hospital room opened. She froze, barely breathing. He stood in the doorway. Brandon, tall, strong, exhausted, his eyes red with worry. "Jacob." His voice was thick with tension as he stepped toward his son's bed. Alice rose to her feet, her heart pounding like a drum. Jacob opened his eyes. "Dad." Brandon rushed to him, dropping to his knees beside the bed. He ran his fingers over his son's face as if he couldn't believe he was real, alive. "Oh God, my boy." His voice broke. Jacob gave him a weak, quiet smile. "I'm okay." Alice felt something tighten inside her. Because it was a lie. He wasn't okay, and neither was she. But how could she say that? Brandon finally exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment before turning his gaze to her. His dark eyes locked onto hers. "Alice?" His voice shook with emotion, but there was something else beneath it. He was waiting for an explanation. He wanted to know what had happened to his son. And in that moment, Alice realized she had two choices. She could lie. Say they had been out walking and he had fallen through the ice by accident. She could pretend she was the hero who had saved him. Or she could tell the truth. She didn't know which was scarier. "It was my fault," she whispered, but to her own ears, the words sounded as loud as thunder. Brandon tensed. Jacob watched silently. Alice swallowed hard, searching for the right words, but there were no right words. Brandon waited. "What do you mean?" His voice had sharpened. Panic rose inside her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't look him in the eye. But she had to say it. She owed him the truth. She couldn't lie to his face. She had no right to. "I pushed him," she said in a single breath. And the world collapsed. The room fell into dead silence. Alice felt the air grow heavy, as if the entire hospital room had turned into a vacuum. Brandon didn't move. His eyes, filled with relief just moments ago, were now empty, as if all life had been drained from them. "What did you just say?" His voice was hollow, low, like the strike of a hammer. Alice trembled, but she couldn't take it back. She had already taken the first step. She couldn't lie again. She had no right to. Her voice shook, but she forced herself to continue. "I took him to the lake. I wanted him to disappear." Every word was killing her. Brandon closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths, as if he was trying to stop himself from tearing her apart. His voice cracked. "You're telling me that you tried to kill my son?" He didn't yell. He spoke slowly, rigidly, as if each word burned him from the inside. Alice let out a broken sob. She wanted to cover her ears, to disappear. But this was the truth. Her disgusting, horrifying, unforgivable truth. She had pushed him. She had left him to die. And now, standing face to face with his father, she fully realized the depth of her sin. Brandon stood abruptly. He turned away from her, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He flinched when Jacob spoke softly. "Dad." Brandon froze. Jacob looked at him, and in his eyes was something inexplicable. Not fear, not pain, something deeper. "I know," the boy said quietly. "I remember everything." Alice sucked in a sharp breath. Her world was collapsing. Brandon turned to his son, his movements stiff. You knew this whole time?" Jacob nodded. "Yes." Brandon couldn't believe it. "And you—" He fell silent, afraid to say the next word. "Forgave her?" He couldn't believe it. But Jacob didn't answer. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Brandon shut his eyes, his whole body tense. Then he turned back to Alice, and now in his eyes there was nothing. No love, no hatred, only emptiness. "Get out." Alice flinched. She had known this was coming. She had known she would lose him forever. But hearing those words was worse than any pain she could have imagined. She stood. Her legs were unsteady, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. She looked at Jacob. Jacob. His eyes shimmered with tears, but he didn't look away. She wanted to say something, but she had nothing left to say. She had already said everything she could, and now it was over. She left without looking back. Alice walked down the hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. But she didn't hear them. She didn't feel her body. She wasn't aware of what she was doing. The only thing that existed in her world was the echo of Brandon's final words. "Get out." His voice had shattered her into 1,000 pieces. She had feared this moment. She had known it would come. But not even in her darkest nightmares could she have imagined how much it would hurt. She walked without direction. People passed by. Some were smiling, some were laughing, some were crying outside the rooms of their loved ones. And she just kept walking. Without purpose, without thoughts. As if she just kept moving, reality would blur. As if she went far enough, this would stop being true. But it was true, and that truth was killing her. She stepped outside, and the cold air sliced across her skin. But she didn't feel it, because inside she was already frozen. She had been dying inside ever since Jacob had said he remembered everything. But back then she still had hope. Now she had nothing. She wanted to scream so loudly it would tear the sky apart, destroy this pain. But when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. She walked, not knowing where she was going, but her feet led her there anyway. To the lake, icy, black. It lay before her like a gaping abyss, like before, like that day, that moment, when she had pushed him. She collapsed to her knees in the snow. Her hands trembled. She remembered. She remembered everything. "I forgive you." Those words crashed through her mind over and over. They wouldn't let her rest. They were worse than torture, because she couldn't accept them. But now he wouldn't say them again. Now he had chosen his father. Now she was alone. She let out a choked sob, and then she broke. Loud, ragged, violent, like never before. She slammed her fists against the ice, the snow, the ground. "Why?" Her voice cracked into a sob. "Why didn't I die with him back then?" Her scream shattered the silence of the night, but no one heard her. She was alone. She stood up, took a step toward the water, and realized how easy it would be to end it, right here, right now, right in this place where she had destroyed her life. She looked down at the smooth black surface and understood that she should have drowned that day, not him. But something stopped her. Not fear, not regret, something else, as if a voice from the past had found her in the darkness. She let out a shaking breath, her legs giving way beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, clutching her head in her hands. "Forgive me," she whispered. "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me." But no one heard her. No one answered. and all she had left was silence. Silence heavier than death itself. She didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes, hours. She sat by the lake, utterly broken, empty. She had lost everything, and now she had to choose. Stay here, in the cold, in this frozen silence, and just wait until everything was over, or find a way to atone for what she had done. She didn't know if she could ever be forgiven, but she had to at least try. 2 years had passed. Alice never returned to that town. She never saw Brandon again. But she watched over Jacob from afar. He was growing. He was happy. She never tried to reach out to him. She had no right to. But she tried to become better, not for herself, for him. Because if he had been able to forgive her, she couldn't just throw her life away. She had to prove that his forgiveness hadn't been in vain. She got a job at a children's support center, working with kids just like Jacob. She listened to them. She helped them. She learned how to love again. And on quiet nights when she was alone, she would whisper into the silence, "Jacob, I hope you're happy." And it was the only prayer she had ever spoken. One day, on a warm summer afternoon, she received a letter. No return address. Neat, careful handwriting. "I know you're trying, and I hope you're happy too. Jacob." Alice clutched the letter in her hands and wept, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? Share your story. Don't miss new stories that will touch your soul. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to be the first to see our latest videos.